We had W.E.B. Du Bois and the Talented Tenth, where basically the whole theory of that is that 10% of Negroes are the ones who should be ruling the 90% of Negroes. And he actually has a comment that he made where he said he think the black people should hitch their wagon to a star instead of to a wagon, which I think is grotesque, but it actually influenced one way or another the current education structure that we have right now. Because at the same time, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who was on the opposite end of that, basically saying that everyone had the ability to learn and to run their own business and to have these different skills. So at the same time that conversation was happening, you have Dewey and can't remember the other guy's name, but they're having the same conversation about the white people sort of after Reconstruction too in America. And this is what is basically running the whole educational structure, is this whole, only a certain group of people should be allowed to run the culture. I mean, that's what you've heard with Obama. I mean, he was the first that was clean and articulate. They said. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, you see it. It's interesting because I never realized it went back that far, but they had basically just reappropriate these ideas from culture to culture, from generation to generation.
It's almost like a philosopher king, Plato's philosopher king.
Well, I see it a lot as like a groomed subset of the population that is meant for leadership positions. You can see a lot of like very explicit programs within schools in the US, and I think that it is relatively unique in that respect because you don't see the same quote unquote talent programs abroad, like at least in my experience. Yes,
I've actually read up on the GATE stuff.
That's exactly what I'm referring to.
It's a direct pipeline.
It's a pipeline, and a lot of it has to do with like this idea that you can teach leadership, which I find preposterous. But in general, the reason that they have to come up with this idea that you can teach leadership and you can teach leadership skills is because they select these students with certain personality types and certain predispositions, and they might lack in charisma, so they'll try to like push it up with these courses. But there's this really strong and like explicit effort in the US to create this intelligentsia that's all channeled through the same pipeline, which I find very intriguing because it's not how it's always done. It is not by any means the only way to do things or organize your educational system.
Well, the intelligentsia right now is just weird. It's sad. I think that the stage of the intelligentsia today is...
Well, again, that's why I'm saying it's very much a question mark as to the success of this particular philosophy.
It's been hugely unsuccessful, and that's part of the problem, is that these people think that they can pick winners and losers. I mean, at least in the system you all were describing, people were sort of born into it. Now it's kind of like, okay, well, we need to bring some Negroes in, so let's just see which ones are, decent enough, which ones can speak well. Let's just pick the ones that can talk good, put them in front. It's just nonsense. Like, I was studying Frederick Douglass last night, a few weeks ago, and I said, he sounds like Obama. This is the same story as Obama. Did they literally just transplant these people from generation to generation? It's the same story. All of a sudden, it's clean, articulate Black man shows up, and even that whole story of him is sort of questionable if you think about it at any sort of depth. He just shows up, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, this is the guy. He's the one that's going to emancipate
Thomas
the
Sowell,
Black folk.
Would you put Thomas Sowell in that? Would you describe Thomas Sowell that way too?
I have a hard time with Thomas Sowell because I would put him more in the category of like a Carter G. Woodson, who sort of like Carter G. Woodson. He was very much against what W.B. Du Bois was teaching, but at the same time, he didn't go against him publicly. So I think that's sort of like a personality trait of a Thomas Sowell. Like, he's against what these people are doing, but he's not out in the trenches, fighting people like, Booker T. Washington was, who was literally at the White House with Roosevelt, like, and Roosevelt said, "This is my dude. He's gonna go where I go." You know, he wasn't like out there, but he was writing a lot of stuff to sort of backfill what's going on. There's a book called The Miseducation of the Negro, which came out in 1930, I think. And I just started reading him about halfway through, and it's pretty amazing because he literally calls out so many. I mean, he calls out the Methodists, the Baptists, he calls out the whole NAACP almost by name. The Methodists and the Baptists he calls out by name, but he doesn't call out W.B. Du Bois by name at all. But he does call out Booker T. Washington in a positive way. So that's how I view Thomas Sowell. Like, he'll call people out, but he won't call you out by name and say, "You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong." It's more of a, you know, maybe we should try this. Maybe this is a better idea. It's more political, I guess, more diplomatic. So I wouldn't, but I have a problem with Thomas Sowell because that's the only Black author that white conservatives seem to know. And there's a lot better ones, especially when you get like a Carter G. Woodson or a Benjamin Banneker, or, I mean, there's a lot of older people who are saying the same things. If you would only pick up the books, I mean, download them online for free, because these books are from the books. To me, any history that comes after, any Black history after 1950 is fraudulent. I don't believe any of it. I think it's
there was a lot
fraudulent.
of communist activism going on during that time. Like, even Rosa Parks, she attended a school.
Oh my
that was
God!
set up
Please don't get me started on Rosa. I'm sorry.
No,
it's a Rosa Parks fan.
It's a very interesting thing to read about all of this stuff having to do with how much money the Soviet Union put into various programs here in America to subvert various things, and it's an interesting, it's an interesting thing to look back at.
You can especially see there's a lot of Soviet...
Hold on. I've never heard what's Rosa Parks. We had Rosa Parks stay at school. Like, I know Rosa Parks.
Oh, so would you like me to tell you the problem with Rosa Parks? Yes. Let me tell you the problem with Rosa Parks. First of all, she was the fourth person to do it. The first person was a dark-skinned Black girl who had a baby, sat in the front of the bus, and they ignored her. They let her go to jail with her baby. Didn't care. Four other people did it before Rosa Parks. Why did they pick Rosa Parks? Well, she was light-skinned. She could pass for white. She had no record. She didn't have no kids. She looked the part. Everything about the civil rights movement is a photo op. Every single thing you know about the civil rights movement is fake. Completely. MLK drives me nuts. He was a philanderer like I've never seen, except for Frederick Douglass, maybe. These people stuck around. No joke. Like, all of them. This whole thing, like, there's a segment of the Hoteps, like I said, my segment, the Hotep Nation Hotep. We're rereading history, and we're like, no, that was just like this whole thing with Harriet Tubman. People are like, Kanye West said Harriet Tubman didn't free no slaves. Well, that's true. Where did she take them? The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves in the North. So if she was taking people to the North, they weren't free. They were still slaves. They were just not on the plantation anymore. So what was she really doing? Taking them from one master to another one.
So
that's
there was no
statement.
So there was no positive outcome out of what Harriet Tubman actually did?
No, that's not what he was saying. No, that's not what he was saying. He was just saying...
I would just like to know if, like, if it's just moving from one place to another.
He's just saying that, like, if you're gonna put someone on the money, like if you're gonna pick a symbol, right? Like, what was that expression?
It shouldn't
like,
be her. Okay.
Hitch to a star or hitch to a wagon, or like if you're
right, yeah, hitch your wagon, hitch your thing to a star instead of a wagon. You know, it's not a problem to talk about these people in positive light. Like, if they talked about the fact that there were 4 other people to do the bus boycott before Rosa Parks, I wouldn't have a problem. But and just like if they were to say, oh, well, the real power behind the civil rights movement wasn't MLK, it was actually Ella Baker, because she was the one who ran the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission. She's the one who got the kids organized. If they were to talk about it and not leave out some of the less known but more important figures, I wouldn't have a problem. But to elevate these people to godlike status, where I, a Black American, Negro American am supposed to worship these people, I'm not worshiping them.
I understand.
That's my
You have this tendency to put to elect one star or image of an entire movement, or
it shouldn't
whatever.
be that.
But it's the beautiful thing. Oh, I'm being sarcastic here when I say beautiful, but the reasoning behind selection of these icons is because then, especially if you already own them from the beginning, then you control the entire narrative, and that's what happens over and over and over again.
Like a Bill Clinton. I mean, that is an example of someone who is very smart. I think Bill Clinton's very brilliant, but at the same time, since this is someone who has a proclivity for sleeping around, it's that much more easier to control someone like that.
Yeah, he's got to sleep around because his wife is lesbian.
Well, that's certainly a part of it, I think. I mean, allegedly, I don't know what exactly.
Maybe Hillary's just getting a little buddy with Ellen DeGeneres or something. I don't know.
Huma Abedin. But have you guys heard of Stanley Levison? Stanley Levison. He's the guy who wrote MLK's speeches. Apparently, he's basically MLK, like the guy on stage saying words. Is just playing a character. At the end of the day.
How is that any different from Obama? I'm sorry,
right. No, and what didn't Obama study? Wasn't Obama like an Alinskyite or something in Chicago? And it's also interesting to look into. This is also well noted. Like Cory Booker, he ran for president in the winter, and apparently he has like a lifelong friend that he met in college. This friend of his, I should look up. I could look up his name if it's very relevant, but this guy's very well connected, and he basically said. Since college, he told Cory and everyone they know, "Oh, you're going to be president someday." And he's been on TV and doing interviews, telling everybody, "Oh, Cory's going to be president." So basically, you can see him groom. You can see how this grooming process works. How these people are selected, and the kingmakers put them in the position that they're in. I mean, this is if you do a little bit of research, you can see how this all works. It's not really a big secret now.
I would like to also add, back to the MLK thing, I feel like American education deliberately celebrates stories like MLK and Rosa Parks and Gandhi in order to sort of like, they deliberately do it in order to make... No. They deliberately do it in order to make what would be radical leftist ideologies or civil rights activists kind of more docile by feeding them this myth that every single person that has done change for the positive is only peaceful, nonviolent, when that's actually the opposite. And they omit a lot of the more radical ideas and movements that fueled the civil rights movement in the 60s that led to the actual change. Like, change doesn't come from kind of being like the moderate, peaceful person that American
pacifism doesn't work. It's never worked, ever.
Pacifism just leads to you getting your ass beat.
Yeah, it's a false narrative.
You got to go all the way to the other side to get any sort of like slight change in the system, because if you only go halfway, they're not going to meet you halfway. You have to go all the way to the other side for them to meet you halfway.
Peace is a pipe dream.
Yeah,
it can only exist temporarily.
The thing that really
back to that Art of War quote I made up.
Speaking of the meeting you halfway, I think is sometimes a bit of a wishful
thinking. Are you coming
thinking.
out? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sophia's apparently coming out.
Sophia, what were you gonna say?
I'm so sorry. That was a
good
people in and out.
That was a good soundbite. Are you coming out?
I was so loud. I'm so sorry.
No, that was a perfect soundbite. So, Sophia, what were we gonna say? Well, I say Sophia, by the way, yeah, because there are two Sophias here.
Yeah, I can go by Antipodes. I'm not picky. But what I was gonna say is simply that when you have this idea that like they're gonna meet you halfway, I think it's often wishful thinking, because often these compromises are things that they don't really care about. When Solidarność was a really big movement in Poland, and we were the big peaceful movement that emancipated us from the control of communist Russia and their hegemony. As it turns out, that was not a move that was terribly advantageous to us, because Russian leadership was still predominant and still is to this day. It just not in the government anymore. It's in the media. Things move around in terms of labeling, but things don't change that much even when you have like these wins that are like, you're sitting at the table with the big guys, you're having these compromises. These compromises very rarely are equal or advantageous to the newly arrived party.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing though that looking back on what was going on in the '60s, while it's great that Jim Crow was done away with. What's unfortunate is
was it?
Well, we can get. I mean, when you have a government, my view on this is that when you have a government system that prevents people from doing what they would choose to do, and I also believe in freedom of association as well. I think those two things could coexist. Like, for example, in Russia, I think a big problem was that people were segregated so much by this class system that it was very hard to get ahead, even if you were smart and curious. Despite that, though, we did have great examples of people, even within that system, being able to thrive. Like, for example, Anton Chekhov, whose father was a serf. So he came from this really low class, yet he became one of the most brilliant writers in Russian history. So there are definitely examples of that, but those examples, I think, are important to make note that this idea that it's all about, who your parents were, who your ancestors were, that you pass the torch on, it doesn't always work that way when it comes to brilliant writers like Chekhov coming from that really low caste background. But regardless of that, that is why I think that something like a government declared system like Jim Crow, I would look down on that. But the point that I was making about Jim Crow specifically was what ended up getting rid of it was unfortunately a system that was empowered by the Soviet Union. So back to Rosa Parks, it says over here in this book, The Age of Entitlement, which I highly recommend everybody to read. It's a really interesting book talking about the laws that were passed in the 60s. It said that 5 months before the monogamy bus boycott began, Rosa Parks attended the Highlander Folk School in Newmarket, Tennessee, an academy that the Congress of Industrial Organizations had set up for training social agitators. She was an organizer of considerable sophistication, one of the intellectual leaders of the monogamy and NAACP chapter. So there was a lot of
the NAACP is a huge problem. I think that a lot of that propaganda money went into the NAACP, and you can sort of see how this happens. So much of Black history is just nonsense. But a lot of MLK was actually trained in the CIA camp, because I remember seeing the pictures. So was Malcolm X. Another sort of radical Black movement they don't talk about is Marcus Garvey's movement. And so the thing about not being able to accomplish anything from peace is entirely accurate, because on the show last night, Hotep Jesus and Uncle Hotep show, they were talking about how basically the whole bus boycott, like I said, was a photo op. So you have this John Lewis guy who basically took a dive for the cameras. They called the police ahead, told the police, okay, we're going to do this thing, send your police, let's get the pictures, whatever. And so they did their photo friendly setup early in the day. And then the real people, the Hoteps, found out from the radio, they're beating up our people, so on and so forth. And so then they went down to where these police and all this stuff was happening, and they started fighting the police. I mean, this is that's what really happened. And that's one of the things about, the history. I mean, the whole history in general that drives me crazy. Is like, there's nothing is happening with peace. And also another thing with Frederick Douglass's story, I went back and looked online to see what they said about his story. I read his autobiography. He said that he actually, in order to get freedom, or to get away from the plantation, which is a whole nother set of problems. He, in his autobiography, he says that he killed one of the British soldiers. But if you go and look up Frederick Douglass right now, even on the the Frederick Douglass house and like the official narrative, they don't say he killed the soldier. Well, I remember vividly learning that he killed the soldier, but see, I didn't learn my Black history in school. I learned, because I'm from Maryland. I'm from Maryland at least 10 generations. And so I learned my Black history from church, because my particular church participated in the first Negro History Week, the first Women's History. My church is a very, very old church. So we were like there when all of the community I'm from is, it was one of these slave communities, but it was just, that's why I don't even believe slavery happened the way that it did, because I know my own history and it doesn't add up. Not the way that, maybe some places had plantations and they were bad and all of that, but in the Washington, D.C. region, it wasn't exactly like that. It was completely different than what is told in the books. But so because I learned my history from my own family, from my own experience, I have a different sort of view of it. And I think that it is important for people to learn as much about their own story as possible, because then you can line it up against what you're hearing in the media or what you're learning in school and say, that's not true. That didn't happen. What are you talking about? Or I don't think that's what it how it worked out. Or my great grandmother was alive. So I was like, did you go to school? She was like, yeah, I went to school. I'm like, so wait a minute. I thought Black people couldn't read. So you went to school in the early 1900s when allegedly there were no schools. Explain. So what they're telling me in school is not working. So I was able to fact check against my own history, which I think is a huge benefit for people who can do it, which is why another reason why I find you guys interesting, because you can actually fact check against your own history. But most Black people, since they have no idea of anything, they can't even fact check against their own history. They don't even know where to start. Most people. So they believe whoever tells them.